Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on war crimes in Yemen. I am Diana, Head of Advocacy at Democracy Center for Transparency. We are honored to have you all with us today. We warmly welcome MEP Katalin CSEH, Vice Chair of Renew Europe Group and member of Committee on Foreign Affairs and Subcommittee on Human Rights. Thank you for joining us. We further have the privilege to receive MEP Marc TARABELLA, Vice Chair of the Delegation for Relations with Arab Peninsula and member of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats Group. Thank you for being with us. We are also pleased to have MEP Barry Andrews, member of Renew Europe Group. Thank you very much for joining us. The war in Yemen has left thousands dead and caused the world's largest humanitarian crisis, where millions of people have been facing starvation, with thousands dying as a direct result of the lack of the access to the health care and medical support. On the aspect of human rights, Houthi forces, the Yemeni government, and the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and different UAE and Saudi-backed Yemeni armed groups have arbitrarily detained people, including children, abused detainees, and held them in poor conditions, and abducted or forcibly disappeared people perceived to be political opponents or security threats. Women in Yemen are experiencing gender-based violence and other blatant violations, including forced marriage, sexual harassment, forced pregnancy, rape, polygamy, and health services deprivation. We are here today to discuss this issue with our guests. MEP Katalin CSEH, we would like to start our webinar giving you the lead to elaborate on this human rights situation in Yemen and the role of international actors in this regard. MEP Katalin, can you hear me? Yes, we would like to start our webinar giving you the lead to elaborate on the human rights situation in Yemen and the role of international actors in this regard. MEP Katalin CSEH.
Thank you very much. I do apologize, I just got dropped out of Zoom. Thank you very much for inviting me and the possibility to share my thoughts on this very important and very, well, very serious issue, which is the conflict of Yemen. So if I have the floor first, let me just start by stating that in the case of Yemen, we see yet another conflict that is rooted in an unsuccessful Arab Spring transition. And what started as a relatively peaceful transition, it has first escalated into a very heated local conflict and eventually into a full-blown war with more than a dozen countries implicated and with winners, losers, or in the end in sight. And as always, the effects are clearly devastating. In short, this war has escalated into the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with more than 80% of the population in very acute need of humanitarian assistance. And according to the United Nations, almost 20 million people need help to secure food, access healthcare, or clean water. And almost 10 million of them are considered to be one step away from famine, which is an incredible number. More than 2 million children are severely malnourished, and 4 million people are displaced internally. So this is really an extremely serious situation. And these are only the raw numbers. And behind these numbers, we see an indescribable amount of human suffering, individual tragedies, lives ruined, families torn apart, or broken up forever. And vulnerable groups such as women or children are particularly exposed to the horrors, but unfortunately, this does not mean that this difficult situation is only the legacy of the current conflict. Because even before the civil war has started, we know that Yemen has been ranking the lowest in the world for every number regarding gender equality. There is a very rigid patriarchal society in place, which means that women and girls cannot enroll into education, they cannot access their family's finances, they cannot make decisions about the household or even move about freely. And of course, the war and conflict has added other layers of vulnerability for them, further exacerbating those gender inequalities that already limited access to basic livelihood opportunities, and at the same time contributing to violence against women. And during the years of war, abuse and violence grow, according to the UN, with a further 63%, which means more than 3 million women and girls are at risk of gender-based violence. So, of course, this correlates directly with the broader situation in the country. The infrastructure and basic services are disrupted. Daily life, domestic violence are growing to a bigger and bigger issue. Women are forced by circumstances to travel longer in order to secure daily supplies for their families, or even just do their daily business. And often that happens without the company of a family member, as it is customary in Yemen. And unfortunately, even the closeness of family members do not mean safety. As the conflict wears down, the society and the changes of the dynamics of family life, domestic violence increases even further. And survivors of sexual violence and abuse have virtually no access to either healthcare situation or any counseling that they would need. And just one more thing I need to state here is that as the global situation around COVID and other international problems escalate, there is a situation developing where we are getting more and more numb to existing conflicts, and underreporting the crimes in Yemen is a very serious problem. This is why I'm so glad that we have this event, that we can talk about this more. And we have to state that until the conflict is not resolved, it is extremely challenging to improve the situation of women. And even then, change will not happen overnight. Yeah. The legal system has to provide for necessary protection for women who suffered assaults and abuse. And empowerment of women once the crisis is over is an absolutely essential element of bringing back Yemen to normality, to execute an economic and societal shifts that has to lay down the foundation of a new country full of hope. I don't know if I still have time left, but if I do, I would like to go into the situation of children, which is also very, very dire. I don't know how much time do I have still, or?
You have the time, you can go on.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. So, because I think it's very important to talk about the problems of the vulnerable groups and children. The situation of children is in many ways very similar to the situation of women. A lot of children are born and raised in poverty, negligence, violence. They are victim of circumstances, basically, as they found themselves into the middle of the war. As I said before, they are in an increased risk of malnutrition, declining life expectancy, something that frankly almost entirely unseen in the 21st century. And what is very important to point out here is the issue, very serious issue around child soldiers. Children are very often tricked into joining militias, recruiters luring them away from home, promising stability, lucrative jobs that can help their families to make ends meet. And the Saudi-backed rebels even went one step further away from this point by essentially recruiting child soldiers from Sudan and using them as basically disposable ground troops during intense times of fighting. And we have that this violates an numerous international covenants, and many of which has been signed by parties in the conflict. It's known that the use of children below the age of 15 in war is prohibited by the Geneva Conventions, or like an additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions. And this is actually recognized as a war crime under the Rome Statute. This applies to both state actors and non-state actors. And under these terms, neither the Saudi-led coalition nor the rebels can justify the recruitment of children to fight in this conflict. And make no mistake, both groups are very much aware of this, as they very vehemently denied knowledge of this by themselves or by the forces they fund. And let me be very clear, these are war crimes, and there must be accountability for the monstrosities these children were put through and were forced to witness. War crimes is something that people have to answer for, and the international community must do everything to ensure that these crimes do not go on unpunished. And of course, against this background, it's very unsurprising, unfortunately, that human rights situation in general in Yemen is truly deplorable. I suppose we will go more in details in this seminar with other aspects. But abuse against civilians is an everyday occurrence, including arbitrary arrest, torture, abduction, forced disappearances, and all parties in this conflict have very serious violations of international humanitarian law. There are no good guys in this conflict. Everybody, all sides are complicit in the most heinous crimes and human rights violations that are imaginable. And to make matters worse, the very small number of NGOs who are still active in the region are often prevented from doing humanitarian work. Human Rights Watch has documented that all parties to the war restrict the delivery of humanitarian aid to the population. And with no efficient or enforceable legal framework, the issue of accountability arises once again. This is a question Yemen will not be able to answer alone. The international community has to join forces to investigate the war crimes, every human rights violation that took place in the past 6 years and counting. And the EU has to lead the way in setting up an independent committee tasked with such investigations and an analysis of the findings in order to obtain a comprehensive, in-depth image regarding the atrocities committed by all sides. And in the meantime, I believe member states should halt arms export to Saudi Arabia. A large amount of these weapons supplied to the kingdom end up in the hands of Yemeni fighters, fueling the bloodshed and deepening the humanitarian crisis. And let me close by saying that even if right now we don't see an end in sight, our actions have to be guided by our hope for a better future. And if there is a country in the planet that deserves one, well, Yemen is very definitely one of those. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm very glad that you invited me to speak on this very important topic. Thank you very much.
Ms. Che, thank you very much for your contribution. The European Parliament endeavors to enact binding laws in favor of ending the current situation in Yemen. To shed the light on the recent resolution on Yemen, MEP Marc TARABELLA is invited now to give an in-depth overview.
Thank you so much for your invitation. And of course, this resolution, I have to speak briefly because Katalin, Chair, my good colleague, spoke about some key issue that we mentioned in the resolution. Maybe, and I greet also Barry Andrews because we did a great job, and I have to insist on that. Why? Because, for example, I underlined 2 or 3 paragraphs. There are 20, nearby 30 paragraphs, I think 28 in all. And I think that there are 2 or 3 key paragraphs with a strong message towards the main responsible for the situation and the grave and the most grave humanitarian situation in the world for the last 30 years. And Katalin mentioned 24 million people depending on the humanitarian aid, including 12 million children. They are not fighters, they are children. And I think that, for example, the 12th paragraph underlines that EU-based arms exporters that fuel the conflict in Yemen are not compliant with several criteria on legally binding Council common position. The position 2008-944 on arms export reiterates its call in respect for an EU-wide ban on the export, sale, update and maintenance of any form of security equipment to members of the coalition, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, given the serious breach of international humanitarian and human rights law committed in Yemen. Paragraph 13, for example, notes, the Parliament notes the decision of a number of member states to impose arms export ban to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, and stresses that weapons export remain a national competence of the member state, calls on all member states to halt the export of arms to all members of the Saudi-led coalition, calls on the High Representative for the European Union to report to the current state of member state military and security cooperation with a member of Saudi-led coalition, condemns the supply of significant volume of weapons and components of the Houthi movement by Iranian individual entities. And for example, I don't give all paragraph, but the 27th, it's also important because it members and the Parliament reiterates its commitment to fight against impunity for crimes of war, crimes against humanity, and gross human rights violation in the world, including in Yemen. Believes that the individual responsible for such crimes should be duly prosecuted and tried in court of law. Calls the EU and the member states to take resolution action towards a referral by the United Nations Security Council of the situation in Yemen to the International Criminal Court, and an expansion to the list of persons to subject to the Security of Council sanction. Why I would like to remind those paragraphs? Because the vote of this resolution was a little bit historical in the Parliament. It's not me to focus on that because before I was not involved in the Arabic Peninsula, but my colleagues and the civil servant in the Parliament said, historical. Why? Because it's a huge vote, and I give you some details on that, giving a strong resolution concerning some country of the Gulf. And of course, we mentioned expressly Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, because they are the main responsible for the humanitarian situation in Yemen and the war and crime of war. And I think that those paragraphs were adopted with a large majority, but including those paragraphs at the end, could you imagine that on 698 colleagues, 643 voted in favor, 12 against, and 44 abstention. And if never I check the detail between our political group, because we were quite all on the same line. Example, EPP, 191 votes, 190 in favor, 1 abstention. Also Renew, and I mentioned I greet my two colleagues, and we were very strongly colleagues and in the same line in the negotiation with Barry Andrews, 84 and 1 abstention. In my group, 147, all okay. Also in the Grey group and the Greens. Only 12 far-right colleagues voted against the resolution. The 12 unique parliamentarians who voted against are from the far-right party. But 35 of this group, the far-right group, voted in favor of the resolution. It means that 92% of the colleagues voting in favor means that it's a strong message to the responsible of this crisis. And never it happens before in such a large majority. I think that the situation is changing, and we note also, and in the resolution also we welcome the new position of the United States of America. It's very important also. Their influence is very important, and I think that something is changing. I hope that with a strong message, of course, strong message, change in the United States, maybe we can also improve the situation, humanitarian situation in Yemen. This war will stop. now diplomacy negotiations are needed, and to try to give a better future, simply a future to the people in Yemen. And of course, we welcome to all process of negotiation. And I think that we did. It's not me to saying that. It's my. But they recognize. Some people recognize. Wow, what is a strong message? And sometimes, you know, some resolutions are also voted with a large majority, but without strong message like this. And it was unexpected that with some strong message from the European Parliament, the resolution would have a very large majority of vote. This is maybe unique in the story of the resolution concerning the country in the Arabic Peninsula, and I think that it would be I hope a positive message for the future, and to of course to find a better situation for Yemeni people, that they merit that, because the war causes, and I repeat, the most grave humanitarian situation in the world. I think it was very important to obtain a resolution, and of course to have this strong message. Thank you.
Mr. Tarabella, thank you very much for your valuable contribution. And referring back to highlight the human rights situation, accountability, and the role of international actors, we would like to listen to MEP Barry Andrews.
Thank you very much, and thanks for organizing this event this afternoon. You've heard from Katalin on the humanitarian situation, which she outlined very, very clearly, which is the worst humanitarian situation on the planet at the moment, by, I think, universal admission across all institutions, the UN, the EU, etc. And Mark has outlined the political response from the European Union, and that goes hand in hand with the diplomatic response of the EU and the response of the development community and the humanitarian community. So the full weight of Team Europe is behind focusing on resolutions, and I think it's very clear this far into this conflict that there is no military solution. There certainly isn't a humanitarian aid solution, and the only solution is a political and diplomatic one. So it is promising that we had such a clear statement of principles and calls for action from the European Parliament, and it aligns very well, I think, with the seeming intentions of the new US administration. So let's just hope that 2021 is not another lost year for Yemen. So I'll just focus my comments on the question of impunity and accountability for war crimes that have occurred. And a lot of war crimes have been recorded by the UN GEE. They have recorded many incidents of targeting by airstrikes of civilian infrastructure, whether they be schools, hospitals, markets, and even weddings and funerals. And this has been, there has also been many violations of international human rights law by the opposition, by the Houthi group. And so there is a growing body of evidence. But what to do with this evidence, and where is this evidence, and how can it be secured? It's an interesting exercise to compare the overall ecosystem of accountability in Syria with the overall ecosystem of accountability in Yemen. There are in place, in the case of Syria, many mechanisms to gather evidence, to prepare briefs, to develop prosecution cases, and to obtain witness statements from diaspora, from experts. In the case of Yemen, not so much. And this may be a reflection of the ambivalent attitude of the West to this war for the first early part of it. I think that that's changed now. And I think what has to change along with that political attitude to the conflict has to be a greater focus on calling to account those who've committed these crimes, and more importantly, providing justice to the victims of those crimes. So in the case of Syria, there is an international commission of inquiry, which is responsible for gathering evidence. There is also the independent mechanism, the IIM, which was set up by the General Assembly for Syria, the UN General Assembly in the case of Syria. And since 2016, that has been preparing briefs for prosecutions. In the United States, there is a Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which is being used in the case of Syria, but not in Yemen. There is a Commission for International Justice and Accountability in the US, which has been feeding into cases involving Syria, but not Yemen. And so these are two similar crises of a different geopolitical complexion. And so on the one hand, in the case of Syria, we have an awful lot of appropriate mechanisms to try to bring people to justice, but in the cases of Yemen, not so much. So we also see that there are cases developing in the EU itself. For example, in Germany, there is a case in which there will be a judgment this week involving a Syrian guard who is being prosecuted under the principle of universal jurisdiction in Koblenz in Germany. And there are two defendants, and there's going to be a judgment in one of those cases this week. And there have been cases against, of course, foreign fighters that have found themselves on EU territory or in US territory. They have been prosecuted. And I read an analysis of some of these cases, and the tendency is for the majority of these types of universal jurisdiction cases and foreign fighters cases to be against individuals that were involved in the opposition, and not against the perpetrators of by governments. So, for example, Syrian authorities or Saudi authorities or UAE authorities, naturally. And that's a real challenge. And they involve single incidents. But at least it is evidence that this principle can be applied. There is also an interesting case involving the Dutch government, where it has sent a letter to the Syrian authorities under the Control of Chemical Weapons Convention. And that's going to take a long process. But there's the Dutch government taking the Syrian government to court for abuses under the use of chemical weapons. So Syria is not in the ICC, International Criminal Court. But there are ways in which the ICC can gain jurisdiction, both in the case of Yemen and Syria, neither of them being signatories to the ICC. One is that there could be a referral from this UN Security Council. It's a little bit difficult, particularly in the case of Syria, less perhaps possible in Yemen. But there was a case last year involving Myanmar where there was a jurisdiction was established where Rohingya Muslims were forced to flee to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is a signatory, and so the ICC said they had jurisdiction. So now some Syrian nationals in Lebanon are claiming that the ICC should have jurisdiction because they've been forced to leave Syria. So there are ways to get around the fact that Yemen is not in the ICC, Syria is not in the ICC, in order to ground a case. So I just thought I'd make some comments generally about the ways in which we can, whether it's in the EU or in international tribunals or in International Criminal Court, we can continue to offer the hope of justice for people who have been victims of gross violations of human rights throughout the conflict in Yemen. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Barry Andrews, thank you very much for your contribution. I would like to ask if anyone wants to add something. Okay, thank you all for being with us this afternoon. It has been a pleasure to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Nice to see you. Thank you, Katalin.
Thank you, Katalin and Barry. See you soon, I hope.
Yeah, we'll see you next. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.